Hello, this is Derek Taylor for HIST 140. This is your little preview of modules 11 and 12 for HIST 140, our summer course here. I know the weather last week, so you skipped those last two in terms of a preview. But for this week, you're doing the chapters 11 and 12 in America, I Knew Concise History, I should say, and then chapters 10 and 12 in Major Problems in American history. And you're also going to have a little documentary to watch. We'll talk about that in a second for the readings, part of the readings in chapter 10 Major Problems, and then in chapter 12. And chapter 11 deals with religion and reform and the various reform movements that feed into, especially the abolitionist movement of the 19th century. And then a chapter on the South, specifically, because of course, the big thing with that is slavery, and it develops in a different way than it had the rest of the country does. Oh, you can say the rest of the country develops differently than it, but it becomes kind of like its own entity. And in fact, in my lecture, if I were to give a lecture for this class, my face-to-face class, I called it the Slaveholding Republic, because it's kind of a separate republic almost. And so I'll just briefly go over some things here, talk about the readings, and just a couple of items to note on, first of all, on City on the Hill and everything. A couple of things you'll note about religion in the early 19th century. Remember, this is a Protestant country, and in particular, it's kind of an evangelical Protestant country. We've already talked about in earlier chapters the Second Great Awakening. There are a series of revivals throughout the country. It is a very deeply religious society, is the earlier American Republic. And it kind of gets into everything that sort of, and it goes along with the sort of democratic revolution you read about last week. There's this spirit of reform everywhere, and it has religious origins to it. Virtually every reform you can think of in this period has some sort of connection with religion, whether it be schools, whether it be prison reform, reform of asylums, treatment for the insane and stuff like that. And of course, we'll get to this in a moment, the abolitionism comes directly out of Protestant evangelical Christianity, amongst other things, as does the women's rights movement. They come directly out of this, religious reform ideal, which is, again, kind of unique in the United States, because what's happening here is the free church tradition of Europe's been planted in, I should say, British for the most part. Free church means by a church that's not dependent on the state, has, created a marketplace of religious bodies. They're mostly Protestant. They mostly have a basic, understanding of their faith, but they're competing with each other. And so it's like a marketplace. And in some ways, it's kind of fascinating. You'll get this, and that's what you'll get partly in the documentary, God in America, New Eden, the PBS documentary from 5-6 years ago. It's pretty good. It kind of I wanted to capture the sensibility, because this is a very new thing. It gets hard for you to imagine this because you're used to that. But the idea of not having the state support the church, the idea really of like the state not supporting society, because it really isn't much of a state in the antebellum republic. People do things themselves through voluntary association, well, churches, but like clubs and political groups and all this other stuff. The people do things themselves. And in fact, the influence of religion is so great. This is sometimes referred to the sort of social, networks of the early republic are referred to as the evangelical empire. And I must admit, I'm not an evangelical, but in some ways, this is really impressive. The fact that they, almost, through voluntary effort, do all this and run a country. It's kind of amazing when you think about it. That's one thing I emphasize there. Another thing is that we'll get to the South in a second, both of these chapters will emphasize the impact of Romanticism on Northern religion and Southern as well. But I'm thinking about Romanticism in the North, things like the Transcendentalist movement, but also the sort of utopian drive in the North with all these utopian communities get founded. You'll see what these are. These communes, basically, people trying to live perfect lives. And that perfectionism is also part of this, especially in the North, less so in the South, but definitely in the North. the ideals that these people have that feed into those reform movements. Just to give you an idea, we already talked about the abolitionists, right? And they definitely, I can't stress enough just how far out most of the abolitionists actually were. They were way outside the mainstream of American life in the 1830s and 40s. Only the events of the 1850s that turns the country toward abolitionism, and it doesn't really have. I don't think they really embraced they were really far out, were the abolitionists in religious terms. But that utopianism, that's a big thing. Just to give you an idea, like what I mean by utopianism and how this affects social reform, especially. One of my favorite stories about this era is by a guy named Sylvester Graham, who started life as a Presbyterian minister, a traveling Presbyterian minister. But towards the middle of his end of his towards one point in his life, he abandoned that and became a sort of health nut, like one of the first, like, they had health crazes like we do today, diet fads. Well, he became a one of the first, health gurus, I guess, in the United States. And he founded a bunch of spas, health spas for people, touting the whatever, the tenets of his, I think it was like, you don't eat meat, you don't take tobacco, and all that stuff. It was sort of a health fad diet. And one of the things he invented, I love this story, he invented a cracker that was supposed to be healthy for you. It was made out of ground oat and everything. Well, if you ever had graham crackers, that's the guy that invented them, Sylvester Graham. They're these nasty, disgusting crackers, which I don't think have any nutritional value, but they were sold them as a sort of health food scam. That's very much, to me, it's a good anecdote to capture this zeal for religious reform, but also social reform of all kinds. So that's religion reform there. And then the South expands. In that, you're going to get a look at, the Southern slaveholding society. And a couple of things I'll mention. I think the textbook mentions this as well. One of the things about this society is you should not take its rhetoric for granted. They tended to think of themselves as being a traditional society. And in some ways they did. They were invested in things like classical republicanism, were the slaveholders of the South. But in many ways, it was a very modern society. That sounds backwards. I'm thinking economically speaking, because this was not, they weren't invested in subsistence agriculture. They had one crop, cotton, which basically paid for everything and made them, filthy rich. But that's only possible in a modern capitalist economy. And they ran their plantations very much like capitalist organizations. So it's a modernizing economy they have in a weird way, just one that's really narrowly based. And modern historians have tried to, deconstruct this idea of the Old South as this sort of, charming antebellum thing. And in some ways, again, it's interesting. Some of these things are actually things you wouldn't think about the Old South, the pre-Civil War South. You would think these slaveholders were all a bunch of morons who were uneducated. It's not the case. In fact, in the antebellum South, a higher percentage of people went to college or university than did in the North. These people were educated, intelligent. Years ago, there was a book written by a couple of historians, a husband and wife team, Eugene Genovese and his wife, Elizabeth Fox Genovese, called The Mind of the Master Class. They went through, their views on history and theology and all this stuff. And whatever else you can say about them, they were not stupid. They were not uneducated. They understood history. They had their own ideas about, why slavery was okay. Whatever we think about them morally speaking, we have to understand this to them was just the way the world was. Again, morally speaking, that's insane. But again, this is a world they inherited, and they defended it, with all their skill, which is why you went up having a civil war, of course, eventually. One other thing historians, I'll mention about this as well. I think your textbook mentions this, but the South was not a monolithic place. That's also something, pre-Civil War Southern propagandists like to talk about. It was not totally unified. There were divisions, not just, you have slave versus free, but African slave. But even amongst white Southerners, there's real disparities. Most Southerners don't own slaves. The vast majority of slaves are owned by the people at the very top of the social hierarchy, the 1,000 or so families that run the South. And there is resentment of these planters, these big planters, by poorer Southern whites. And even some of the poor whites who do own slaves, they own a few of them. They have to work beside them in the fields. So there's more tension there than you think. And then, of course, you just have, political divides within the South as well. So it's not quite as monolithic, perhaps, as we used to think it is. One other thing I wanted to mention was about this, and this goes into what I talked about the North, Romanticism. We talked about that a few weeks ago. We read about that in your textbook. Romanticism affects the South in terms of the way it sees itself. And I mentioned they had this myth about what they were like. A lot of this came from literature, and it's not really widely known, but prior to the Civil War, the best-selling novelists in the country were from the South. They were Southern novelists, and they were mostly women. It's kind of hard. I know it sounds weird, but women like Caroline Lee Hentz and Augusta Evans Wilson had bestsellers, sold bestsellers in the North. They were called plantation novels. A lot of them were written to answer criticism of Northern, abolitionists of the slave system. We don't know who these women are anymore because the South lost the war, so we ignore all their literature. But they had, literary journals. They had, arguments about this stuff. They wrote about history. They wrote histories. They had their own. Again, it's not like we shouldn't see it as this is, modernity on the march against some, bunch of troglodytes. It's a very different thing. It's just they happen to be based society on this evil thing. And so it's a strange thing, is to say the least, as well as repugnant to the modern mind. So anyway, that's my little brief overview of that stuff. Just on the readings, I mentioned the textbook. It goes through some of these sorts of things. Talk about religion and some other things as well. The women's rights movement, which I didn't touch on, that also comes directly out of a lot of the evangelical impulses of the age. But then also shall also have, get to this, some your readings and major problems. We'll talk about some of this reform and religion. Again, a lot of interesting stuff in here. You'll have some religious reformers. The Grimkeys are opposed to slavery. They'll base that on Christianity. It'll actually have some of these here. Some of these sources will make clear the transatlantic connections between British and American anti-slavery. You'll have some other reformers. Dorothea Dix is a reformer for insane asylums. Some records of Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of Latter-day Saints. It's also part of this period of the utopian impulse. Some other good stuff. I don't remember what I actually assigned you in terms of the essays. And then chapter 12 is obviously on the South. It gives you, again, some good stuff here. Some of the slave laws of the time, describes the life of planters and what they thought of people, the slaves. Talks about have some sources from slaves themselves, and so you'll get a sort of view from the Southerners themselves as well as from their slaves. So pretty broad in those terms. So again, all this is coming together at the end of this will burgeon when you break out in the 1850s. But you have all this maniacal reform in the North, which Southerners complain about. They blame a lot of what happens on these abolitionists for making trouble and everything, and disturbing their slaveholding republic down there. But you have these sort of, again, it's weird because they do actually, the evangelical stuff is all in the South as well, but it butts up against slavery, whereas it sort of runs free in the North because it's an industrial economy. So it's weird. You have all these, it's a deeply religious country, but it's also shaped by these economic forces and shaped by these other ideas that both, in some ways, both societies share. But no, that's the basic overview for this week. Do comment, by the way, on the documentary. I think it's pretty good. It kind of gives you, again, a sense of where that religious zeal is coming from. Not just in terms of the confidence of the young country, but also there are always worries. Like they talk about this at the very beginning of that video about when the country is born, there's no state church, right? So on the one hand, that's an opportunity, freedom of religion, those sorts of things. But again, it's also an opportunity for people to fall into unbelief. That's why there's this real maniacal, again, it's weird how the religious sphere and the social sphere are so connected, and that there needs to be this sort of manic activity to make sure the country doesn't, fall into damnation, either socially or actually in a religious sense. It's kind of funny. And again, it feeds into this, not just the drive for those things, also the drive against slavery. And that's where things, obviously come to a head later on. Um, just one last thought: the British writer G.K. Chesterton once described the United States as a nation with the soul of a church, which is kind of apt because in some ways the nation is the church for a lot of Americans. And this is kind of just to give you one last broad perspective on this: that the sort of religious quality that people have, or almost religious faith they have in the Republic, it is kind of paralleled in Europe in the 19th century. The establishment of modern nation states, leads to almost what you might call civil religions, where people have this almost, literally, the voice of the people is the voice of God. That was an 18th century Enlightenment phrase. It's almost embodied by all these 19th century revolutions and these republics that they create. This is the first time a lot of these people have had self-government. And there's kind of that same zeal in the United States, but it is unique. And that thing that is unique is just how much, and every year, how much all that energy goes into their social life, and how everything's always hectic and everybody's always doing something. Every visitor from Europe mentions it in the 19th century. They're amazed how much activity goes on in the United States, because it's just not that dynamic or that chaotic in Europe where they came from, unless they're having a revolution. So, but in any case, all that chaos is going on at the same time. You have slavery spreading west, which is going to lead to next week, conflict with the northern states. Power, right? The power conflict is what brings abolition to the fore in the 1850s. So that's all a preview for the future. So that's it. That's my little brief intro for this for these modules. Hope you get something out of this. Have some fun with it, and you will hear from me soon. Thank you, guys.